Whenever it goes. Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. He comes to us from Germany, Deutschland. His name is Dr. Marcel Polte. His last name is spelled Polte. Published a book back in 2019. Title of it in English is Dark New World Order Part 1, MK Ultra Mind Control, Ritual Violence, and a Global Agenda. And it's a very much a bestseller in the continent, in Germany for sure. It has 412 5-star reviews, deserved 5-star reviews. And you can go to the German site and see his other books. I'm going to say they're English titles. Not all of them are in English. The two ones, Dark New World Order 1 and 2, are in English. But there's another one that he published in 2018 in English. The title is Gray's Worldwide Activities and Kidnappings in Germany. And then another one is I Talk My Life and Exit from Satanic Ritual Violence. It's 2021. And then just this year, Non-Human Contact After the Pentagon's UFO Disclosure, What Do We Know? And that again is 2022. Dr. Marcel Polte worked for about 15 years in international law firms as an expert for corporate law and is a co-author of several specialist articles. Besides his work as a legal advisor, he has also been researching scientific mysteries for many years. But again, we're going to talk about this book. Some of these are familiar names to people in my audience. He mentioned Schurter, who I know, and Michael Aquino. I've done shows on Michael Aquino, but also many recent shows on MK Ultra. And again, the title of this book, and you can find it in English, you can find it on Amazon again, is Dark New World Order Part 1, MK Ultra Mind Control, Ritual Violence, and a Global Agenda with Dr. Marcel Polte. So Marcel, welcome to the show.
Thank you, William, for giving me the opportunity to talking to you on this very important topics.
Agreed. So I'm delighted that you reached out to me, or we were so quick in responding. For people who may not have heard your name or your books, can you kind of go into your background, why you got interested in these subjects, and why you wrote this book, Dark New World Order?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I worked for about 15 years in international law firms, well-known names like White & Case, DLA Piper, Hogan Lovells. But during my time at the last mentioned law firm, Hogan Lovells, I also had a private practice as a hypnotherapist, working with clients on quite big range of issues like sleep disorder or anxious disorders and so on. And in this context, I heard first time of so-called ritual abuse. I didn't hear of it before, especially not in my time as a lawyer. However, and this started my research, I was very surprised to see that there's a big amount of facts already accumulated within the literature of experts, of therapists, of psychologists, of psychiatrists working with these clients, with the survivors of ritual abuse for decades or more. And these are German therapists. And when I studied their literature, I found out their colleagues in the USA know the topic as well. And which is interesting, found the same things regarding their clients with respect to what they experienced, in particular mind control techniques and so on. And so this started my journey, I can say, of research and diving into these topics, ritual abuse, which is connected to mind control, and which then led me to the MK Ultra project of the CIA. And then I found out everything is somehow connected. We will get deeper in this during the show. And this was, my start for getting acquainted with these topics that are known in Germany as well, like in the USA. But before me, no one has analyzed the expert literature like this before, and hasn't compared it to the findings of the US American experts in this field. And this is what makes it so interesting when you see the experts in the USA have found out the same details of experiences or of methods applied by the perpetrators. And so you cannot say, this is only a satanic panic, how it was labeled in the 90s in the US, or false memory, or it's a false memory syndrome, when you find the same patterns in Germany or other German-speaking countries like Switzerland or Austria. So this convinced me finally that there's something to this whole phenomenon.
It's really fascinating. And you talk to a lot of people. I saw names. I'm glad that I contacted you because there's names of researchers in Germany I had never heard their names before who've done this same thing. So I was delighted to read that in English. But I know Ellen Lachter, I posted an interview with her.
Great.
She was interviewed. Yeah, it's on my show. So William Ramsey Investigates. But it was done by Visigoth. He gave me permission to put it up. But I thought it was important because this stuff doesn't sound real. I mean, MK Ultra doesn't sound real. Ritual abuse, people don't. I mean, they're very queasy about it, or even satanic based crimes. But there's a lot of people researching. Can you talk about maybe some of the researchers on the continent, maybe their names and their books? Because I know you mentioned them in your book.
I also was in an exchange with Ellen Lecter, but as you mentioned, we have the same kind of experts in Germany, like Michaela Huber. She's a psychologist, one of the very first to not only talk, but to write about this. She published several books on ritual abuse with very graphic and explicit descriptions of what her patients told her, what they had to endure. Then you have, for example, a social worker who was a counselor in a counseling center. Her name is Brigitte Hahn. There's quite a number of names. If you, for example, put into Amazon the German word or the German name for this phenomenon, it's called rituelle Gewalt. Gewalt meaning violence. Then you will find, with the first hit, quite a number of books on the topic by these experts. And another thing that is interesting, all these people know a lot about ritual abuse, what happens there, who are the perpetrators, how they are organized, which techniques they apply, but they only exchange on a professional level. They write their expert books, maybe they write articles in expert journals, maybe they go to events where they exchange information on a professional level, but they are quite afraid to go with this to the public. Michaela Huber, which I mentioned, is one of very few persons that has talked about this publicly, because they have heard from their patients that there are quite influential people in the background. Some of them have received threats, so they try to keep it on a professional level in order to not to get into the focus of these perpetrators. And this is where I see myself, that I take up all this information from very good sources, no internet web pages or rumors or anything. But this is what the experts say, this is what the survivors say, this is what can be found in official documents, and bring this to the public and compare it with the findings in other countries, especially in the US.
And you've done the research. You show in your book you are sending out FOIA requests. They can neither confirm nor deny. So you've done I was impressed. You definitely did the legwork on some of these characters, Aquino, etc.
Yeah, and this was quite interesting. Or interesting for you, that are more familiar with the FOIA and the CIA and then the German audience. I explicitly or specifically asked the CIA for documents regarding Michael Aquino, as well as Kathy O'Brien, who's criticized by quite a number of persons who don't think she's legitimate. However, I can show very good in my book that many details she mentions, locations, persons, techniques, when she published her book in 1995, can be verified. And I asked for documents regarding these persons with respect to MK Ultra or mind control, and received from many locations like military bases, the answer, no records can be found. But the CIA did not say no records can be found, but they delivered a so-called Glommer response, and you also already mentioned it. They said we can neither confirm nor deny that those documents you requested exist, because the circumstance, if these documents exist or do not exist, is under national security itself. And I tried to get further in this process and asked the CIA to review this case. And now it takes for about 4 or 5 years that I'm waiting for an answer on the next level, and hope to get something. But this answer alone shows, at least regarding Michael Kino and Keith O'Brien, that there has to be something regarding their story, because if Keith O'Brien, for example, would be only a liar, the CIA could have said, we haven't heard of her, we have no records, and did not have to use this Glommer response.
Right. So there's a lot of stuff there, and she's not the only person you mentioned. I mentioned lots. Some of these names I didn't know. One of the interesting things was you found some research that I thought I knew a lot about, but it was about the radiation admission from Clinton. Can you talk about that?
This is a very important finding, and many also German researchers haven't heard of it before, because it's an excellent source. In 1995, there were hearings in Washington, D.C. by the so-called Advisory Committee for Human Radiation Experiments, which was put up by President Clinton, and had the assignment to look for survivors of radiation experiments, like its name says, and to have hearings with them, and to find out if the CIA or the military if there was any wrongdoing with respect to radiation experiments. However, there were some MK Ultra mind control survivors that also had experiences with radiation. And this led to the circumstance that a therapist by the name of Valerie Wolf, together with 2 of her patients, Nicole De Nicola and Claudia Mullen, appeared before this committee and gave explicit testimony regarding MK Ultra experiments with children. And this was something that was not known before by the few CIA documents regarding MK Ultra that had survived. And now we had those 3 persons and another patient or another survivor of MK Ultra that talked for, I think, altogether for 30 minutes or 40 minutes about their experiences as children in the hands of CIA mind control doctors. They talked about sexual abuse, about drugs, about electric shocks, and about their multiple personalities. And now we have, due to this circumstances, now we have in the minutes of this committee a transcript of this testimony. And so it's a very important document, which is corroborated by a number of other survivors speaking out after this in the decades that followed. And I think before we go deeper in this, maybe I should explain what is ritual abuse, what is mind control, and what is connection between all of this.
Please do, yes.
Okay, if we talk about ritual abuse or ritual violence, it's important to understand that we are dealing here with family structures that pursue mostly a satanic agenda. In some cases, they use on the outside they use a cover and present themselves as very God-believing Christian families, but behind this cover they are doing satanic rituals. And what is important, we always have family structures. All those survivors that later on may come to therapists, which then found out that they have these ritualistic experiences, always find out that these are families. It's not like a club in which you are introduced. It's always the own family that tries to forward this satanic agenda from generation to generation by training and conditioning their own children to become later on perpetrators. And the second very important finding is that these perpetrators use very sophisticated mind control techniques. They know how it is possible to split the consciousness or the mind of a person. So in the end, you will have dissociative identity disorder, which was before called multiple personality disorder, which is a very extraordinary mechanism or coping mechanism by the psyche if a child comes in a near-death experience. If it has to endure a lot of pain, a lot of terror, sexual abuse, drugs, and so on. And in order to survive this, the personality splits and a new personality part arises. By this, the core personality is protected because this new personality part takes over all the pain or the fear and so on. And this is what the perpetrators are aiming at, because then they can condition by classical conditioning methods this new personality part for whatever they need this person. For example, sexual services, rituals that they want to conduct, and so on. And this is important because these very sophisticated techniques of splitting a personality and conditioning and training this personality part, and we're talking here not about one or a few, these are usually dozens of personality parts that the therapists find within one and the same person. And all this can be found in the US, where we know this since decades, but also can be found in the expert literature by German therapists, which demonstrates that we have here a worldwide phenomenon. And the perpetrators have to work together, have to be in exchange, exchanging information about the techniques they apply, about this programming of their victims. They also exchange the victims themselves, and so on.
Wow, it's amazing. So have you found other international connections other than on Germany or the continent in the US? Do you know if it's happening in other parts of the world, South America, Asia?
I explicitly looked at the German-speaking countries. So besides Germany, I talked to survivors and therapists, for example, in Switzerland. There we have a survivor which had a very deep insight into high-ranking perpetrator circles by the name, it's an alias, Chantal Frey. This is the book that you mentioned, I Speak Out, where I contributed a foreword. And she, for example, as well as others, described the same as, for example, US survivors. And for example, she describes how she has been sent by private airplanes or jets from Switzerland to the US, for example. She even remembers of experiences in the White House. And for example, she remembers of having been in the so-called Dagger complex. It's a military complex held by the NSA in Darmstadt, Germany, where she had experiences of abuse and witnessed child murder, and where she was sent by a small airfield connected to this Dagger complex to the US and other places in the world. But if you have a look, for example, in a book by Randy Noblitt, it's called Ritual Abuse in the 21st Century, there you find a number of contributions by therapists worldwide. For example, I also talked to a therapist from South Africa. She told me the same, speaking of patients that experience ritual abuse, as well as mind control, as well as military and intelligence assignments, and so on. So you can say, at least in the German-speaking countries, in the US, in South Africa, in the UK, and as well in other countries, you find this phenomenon.
Wow, so it's really
this
kind
is
of
the book.
global.
Yeah,
this
great.
is it. And you mentioned this in the book, Noblet, Ritual Abuse in the 21st Century. So, and we talked, we sent emails back and forth. We were talking about paperclip and the influence of the MK Ultra started in the United States in 1953, but there was connections back to World War II, even from the US, but also from Germany. Can you talk about that? And the name that I was trying to remember was Javier von Koss. It's Koss, and he's attached here in the States to the assassination of MLK. So I'll send you that information too when we get done with this interview. But can you kind of talk about paperclip, Mengele, and that stuff you've included in the book?
Yeah, great. It seems by the testimony of the survivors that indeed Nazi scientists who have worked during the Second World War in the Nazi concentration camps later on had assignments with the CIA in the MK Ultra project. And what was very interesting for me, I'm living near Frankfurt in Germany. When I started researching ritual abuse and MK Ultra, I thought, at least with respect to MK Ultra, that this is a US thing. However, I found out that this whole project started near where I live. It's about 15 minutes from where I live. There's a small town of Oberursel. There was the European Interrogation Center of the US military after the Second World War. And there's testimony and also written documentation that near this town, in another very small city called Kronberg, there was a villa in which were conducted the first MK Ultra experiments with Russian war prisoners. And I think Frank Olson, a scientist who's quite famous now with respect to MK Ultra, also was present during some of those experiments. Frank Olson was a scientist who wanted to get out at a certain point of this MK Ultra project, and then fell out of, I think, the 10th store of a hotel room. And his family always tried to find out what was the connection with the CIA and what did he indeed do for the CIA. And there's also on Netflix a small series called Wormwood with his son explaining what he found out in all those years. So I found out about this very interesting connection that the CIA and the US military indeed started some of the experiments in Germany, but that's not all, because many survivors speak of a Dr. Green that participated in their abuse. And this Dr. Green seems to be Josef Mengele, the so-called Archangel of Auschwitz, the Auschwitz concentration camp, who was searched for after the Second World War, for example, by the Frankfurt police for all those crimes he committed. He's said to have killed or gave orders to kill dozens or hundreds of people, and is famous for very cruel experiments in the concentration camp. And he seemed to have worked from the beginning in MKUltra. And many survivors describe direct contact with him. For example, describe how he used German phrases during their abuse or during their mind control programming. So we have very compelling evidence that at least one or several Nazi doctors became involved in those MKUltra projects because the CIA wanted to learn what, for example, Mengele had found out in his very cruel experiments during World War II.
Right, and it all fits together. I think Dulles was in Switzerland during World War II. He was sympathetic to kind of the German views, and so it makes sense when he was head of the MKUltra in '53 that there would be people working for him that came out of World War II. So there's a lot of names. There's a whole another show on Paperclip, but it overlaps with these mind control studies but there were also attempts to really keep this quiet or overturn it or make sure it doesn't come to the public consciousness. Can you talk about the False Memory Syndrome Foundation and some of the characters involved in that?
Yeah. When in the 1990s and in the 1980s it began, a lot of patients appeared in the practices of US American therapists. And those therapists found out that they were talking about the same things, which were ritual abuse, cannibalism, murders they had witnessed or they themselves had to carry out, about mind control, about MKUltra. First, those therapists had to connect themselves to verify those stories that seemed to be totally unbelievable, but found out that their patients, which didn't know each other, talked about the same things. And not only this, many of them had multiple personalities. Many of them had the same programs, induced the same triggers by which certain persons could be called forward, and so on. And one of the first was, for example, Dr. Corydon Hammond. He held the famous Greenbaum speech. You can find it on the internet, but it's not quite easy because after this speech, he drew it back and didn't want to talk anymore about it, although his speech is really fantastic because he disclosed everything in this speech. And the consequence was that he was threatened after this. He and his family became death threats. So he did not talk anymore about this. But with this in 1992 on a conference where he held this Greenbaum speech, it became quite famous among therapists and later on in the broader public that there is this new phenomenon. And the perpetrators reacted to this by constituting the so-called False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which claimed that all those therapists had introduced false memories in their patients' minds, that those patients never had any abuse experiences, had never any ritual abuse, and so on. And the media was very fast in taking this approach and claiming that something like ritual abuse doesn't exist. They called it the satanic panic. And what is interesting, if you look at the advisory board of the so-called False Memory Syndrome Foundation, there are quite a number of experts that had worked before for the MK Ultra project. And so you can ask yourself, how can this be that a psychiatrist worked for MK Ultra, try to find out how you can control the human mind, and after this supports this False Memory Syndrome Foundation. So it's quite obvious that this was initiated by the perpetrator, and you even have it in Germany, where they pursuing the same approach, try to intimidate therapists as well as survivors, and the media as well recently has taken over this the story of false memories in Switzerland, where they kind of had a campaign which aimed at certain therapists and supporters of survivors, and some of them even lost their jobs after this.
Oh, wow. Wow, interesting. So it's happening there. It's happening there on the continent. Amazing.
Yeah.
And here, I mean, some of those names you've seen around, like there's a whole nother book to be done on the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. Martin Orne, Jolly West, all these characters are all, and West was he was a specialist. He really knew a lot. He's an incredible character. Are you ready to take a few questions, Dr. Polte?
Sure.
Okay, great. Let's see. Oswald asks, is Marcel familiar with either Colin Ross or Dr. Rainier Herman Kurtz's work on MKRA?
I'm familiar with Colin Ross, yes. The second name I haven't heard before, but Colin Ross I mentioned in my book. And I think it was Colin Ross who mentioned in his book remote viewing, which is the capacity to receive information via psychic means. And he didn't know that even in, I think it was 2001 or 1999, the CIA had under FOIA disclosed thousands of pages of remote viewing. So you can say the remote viewing project, which was called Stargate, is absolutely confirmed by all those documents. And I gave him the hint. And this is something I realized quite often, that the therapists are very focused on psychology and the experiences with their patients, but sometimes need a broader approach on this. For example, look at things like remote viewing, look at things like out-of-body experiences, which are also often reported by the patients, to get to get the bigger picture of all of this. So yes, I'm familiar with him.
Right, and you mentioned that was one of the sub projects in MK Ultra was this remote viewing. So it goes all the way back. It's one of those things that they were definitely studying. You've mentioned.
Yeah, it was not a sub project in the sense, but the official remote viewing project was a little bit later. That it started in the 1970s. Stargate, and it had other names. However, it is clear from the beginning of MK Ultra that the perpetrators, that the CIA, was very interested in psychic capacities of their victims, of the children's. For example, they tried to teach them how it might be possible to kill another person by psychic means. For example, Carol Rutz, who's written a book, describes this in detail.
Wow, yeah, and that book is available. You can find her book on Amazon, because I came across that. Oswald, he also asked, are you familiar with the claims that Jung experienced ritual abuse himself?
Jung?
Yeah, Carl Jung.
No, I haven't heard before that Carl Jung, is a victim. It's quite possible, because if you take certain persons, you can call them elite or whatever, it's a high probability that they endured as a child abuse, ritual abuse, and so on, in order, what I've explained before, to make them perpetrators later on and to carry on this satanic agenda by their family and by the over generations.
Right, and it makes me think of Eyes Wide Shut, because they had this face mask of Bob Hope in the eyes before the ritual, and he was always rumored to be involved in all this stuff, that he was a Mason. And I think there was one of the victims identified him specifically, right?
So it was Susan Ford who said Bob Hope had been her handler.
Right. So like it ties in, like it's amazing that even Kubrick knew all this stuff, but that's really kind of your book, is this fusing of this mind control, social behavior control, and then the occult, right? The ritual abuse. And that's just in this part one. We're at about 35 minutes. What can people expect to see in part two of your 2-book series?
Yeah, I intentionally did not write one book, but I split it up in 2 parts because in part 2, I wanted to mention some topics that, for example, therapists don't like very much to hear. And therefore, I think as a beginning, part 1 is sufficient. However, if you want to have a broader view or get a bigger picture, part 2 makes sense, in which I mention, for example, that many survivors talk about something like demonic possession. And you even have a international data survey called the Extreme Abuse Survey, which was conducted in 2007, which had 2 parts. One part was addressed to survivors and another part was addressed to professionals. And it's quite interesting that in this professional data survey, one question asked the therapist, did you ever see a patient who has experience with ritual abuse or MK Ultra taken over by, or apparently taken over by an entity? And I can confirm that many survivors, some of them only within the personal contact with me, reported such things. However, you also have to say, or you also have to mention that the perpetrators use this topic also by for example, using masks or simulating things that haven't happened in reality. However, quite a few of those survivors are quite sure that they witnessed or experienced themselves such things. So I go on these topics, for example, like out-of-body experiences, demonic possession, remote viewing, and so on, in a deeper view in part 2 of this Dark New World Order book.
And how has your book been received in Europe when you published it back in 2019? You obviously have had very many sales, because to get to 412 5-star reviews means a lot of people are reading it. Can you talk about its reception and what happened?
Yeah, the part 1 was very well received by survivors, by therapists, as well as the bigger audience. I didn't expect this before because, like I said, no one had before done such an approach by analyzing expert literature, by comparing expert literature from different countries, data surveys, official documents, and so on. However, but I expected this part 2 of my book, where I mentioned those topics like demonic possession, like out-of-body experiences, like entities which might be behind the human perpetrators. There was indeed a lot of criticism by a few readers, even those that liked part 1, because it was out of their belief system, which is okay for me. I respect this. However, I had to write it down because it was part of my research findings. Whenever I also think in the first step, it is enough to talk about ritual abuse and MK Ultra. But if you want to get a bigger picture, you also have to take into account other phenomena.
Excellent. And one question from Joker. Do you know anything about Cambridge Analytics or Tavistock Institute social engineering? Did you come across any of that while you're doing your research?
Yes, I heard the Tavistock Institute quite a few times. I did not get very deep into this because I had just very few legitimate sources, and I only wanted to write about those things which I can back up with good sources and not only rumors on the internet and so on. But my personal opinion is there is something to it. The Tavistock Institute is involved in all of this.
Wow. And I mean, your books are very well researched, so I commend you for that. These are all footnoted. I think you're at like 700, 800 footnotes. So you approached it in a very scholarly fashion. I highly recommend people get this first book. I have not read through the second one, but where is the best place to get these books, Marcel?
You get them on Amazon, on every country's Amazon page. I think this is the easiest way to get it. It's a print version and an ebook version. So yeah, there you get it.
And do you have a website or social media if people want to reach out to you or ask any questions or anything?
Yes, I have a website. It's www.dnwo.de. And there you have a contact possibility if you want to reach out to me. So yeah, you're welcome.
And again, that's www.dnwo.
Yeah, DNWO, like Dark New World Order, the first
first book, and then DE. And really fascinating, great talk, and I really appreciate you coming on. Again, the title of these two books in a two-part series are Dark New World Order Part 1, MK Ultra Mind Control, Ritual Violence and a Global Agenda. And then the second one is Dark New World Order Part 2, The Marionette Players and Their Motives. So I'll have to look into the second one, but excellent job, really well researched. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much and for giving me the opportunity to talk about this.
Awesome. Stay there. Stay there.